Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where every shadow hides a story. Kindly like and subscribe to Sherlock Mysteries. Which part of the world are you watching from? Let us begin. Chapter: I Fee the Collapse. Beneath the chandeliers, it was a bitter February afternoon when London seemed suspended. Between frost and fog, the sky a pale metallic grey, pressing low upon the city's chimneys. Along Regent Street, the gas chandeliers within the finer establishments burned earlier than usual, their wavering yellow light competing with the dying day beyond the tall glass windows. The air carried the mingled scents of coal smoke and damp wool, and carriage wheels hissed upon the wet pavement. It was at 4:15 that Edmund Harrow, jeweller of considerable reputation and discreet patronage, fell forward across his velvet display mid-sentence. I was present. Holmes and I had entered Harrow's establishment scarcely 10 minutes before the incident. The premises were of refined taste rather than ostentation. Polished mahogany cabinets, brass fittings maintained with meticulous care, and long glass cases lined with deep green velvet, upon which rested diamonds, sapphires, and emeralds, arranged with mathematical symmetry. Harrow himself, a spare gentleman in his late 50s with iron-grey whiskers and a complexion suggestive of delicate health, had been discoursing with animation upon a Burmese ruby recently acquired from Mandalay. "You observe, Mr. Holmes," he had been saying, holding the gem delicately between thumb and forefinger. "The internal flame, what the French call the feu vivant. A stone such as this commands respect not merely for its value, but for its character." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Indeed, the crystalline inclusions form a most distinctive pattern. I should be inclined to say the stone has passed through more than one owner of influence." Harrow smiled faintly, though the expression did not reach his eyes. It was at that moment that his voice faltered. His hand trembled, not violently, but with a curious hesitation, as though the body had momentarily forgotten its instructions. The ruby slipped from his grasp, striking the velvet without sound. Harrow's lips parted as if to continue his explanation. Instead, a faint exhalation escaped him. He swayed, clutched briefly at the edge of the display case, and then fell forward across it, scattering sapphires like fragments of fallen sky. One of his clerks uttered a strangled cry. A lady near the entrance shrieked outright. A stout gentleman demanded brandy. Harrow's fingers twitched once, as if still weighing the invisible burden of the ruby, then lay still among the stones. I moved instinctively forward, but Holmes was already beside the fallen man. His long fingers pressed lightly at the neck, then at the wrist. His expression did not alter. "Stand back," he said quietly. Ere the clerk, pale as parchment, rushed to open the door despite the cold. Another fumbled with a decanter. None of it mattered. Within moments, Harrow's breathing ceased altogether. The scene descended into confused agitation until two constables, summoned from a nearby corner, forced order upon the gathering crowd. A medical man was fetched from across the street, a red-faced practitioner whose manner suggested habitual confidence. He examined the body briefly and pronounced the cause with the brisk assurance of his profession. "A seizure," he declared. "Quite common in men of advanced strain, long hours, close attention to fine work. The nervous system rebels. Nothing unusual." "Nothing unusual?" Holmes repeated softly. The doctor glanced at him with mild irritation. "Do you contest it, sir?" "I merely observe," Holmes replied, "that unusual events are frequently mistaken for ordinary ones." The physician sniffed and returned to his inspection. Within minutes, Scotland Yard had been informed. It was during this interval, as the constables took statements and the doctor composed himself for official formalities, that Holmes's attention shifted, not to the body, but to the velvet display. Among the scattered sapphires lay a single gentleman's glove. It was placed upon the velvet with an exactitude that jarred against the chaos of the moment. Dark kid leather, of excellent quality. Right hand, the fingers aligned parallel with the edge of the case. It had not fallen, it had been set down. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "You perceive it also, Watson," he murmured. "The glove. It must belong to one of the patrons, must it?" He reached forward. Not touching the glove directly, but examining its position relative to the fallen stones. The ruby had landed 2 inches from its cuff. Several sapphires lay between the glove and Harrow's sleeve, yet none disturbed its neat arrangement. "It was placed here before the collapse," Holmes said quietly. I felt a faint chill unrelated to the open door. "You suspect?" "I suspect deliberation," he replied. Inspector Bradstreet of Scotland Yard arrived. Shortly thereafter, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. He was a practical man with little patience for speculative intrigue. "Afternoon, Mr. Holmes. Doctor says seizure, does he?" Holmes answered. Bradstreet knelt beside the body. "Poor fellow's been working too hard, by all accounts. No signs of struggle, no disturbance beyond the fall itself." Holmes gestured lightly toward the display. "Except that," Bradstreet followed his indication. "A glove, likely dropped." Holmes lifted it carefully, using his handkerchief. "It has not been dropped," he said. "Observe the crease along the knuckles. The leather has been smoothed deliberately. No distortion from impact, and the position too precise. It was laid here." Bradstreet frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning that Edmund Harrow did not die alone in circumstance." The inspector rose slowly. "You're suggesting foul play." "I am suggesting," Holmes replied evenly, "that we should hesitate before dismissing a death so conveniently explained." Bradstreet hesitated. Though skeptical, he respected Holmes sufficiently to allow examination. Holmes bent once more over the body. He studied Harrow's lips, the faint discoloration at their edge. He examined the fingertips, the nails, the faint scent lingering near the collar. Then he straightened. "Inspector, was Mr. Harrow known to suffer seizures?" Bradstreet consulted the clerk. The young man shook his head emphatically. "Never, sir. Mr. Harrow was delicate, perhaps, but never seizures." Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. "And had he any enemies?" The clerk faltered. "None that I know of. He dealt with important clients, of course. Discreet gentleman, but he was respected." "Respected?" Holmes repeated thoughtfully. He turned the glove inside out with delicate precision. In the lining, faint but legible, were embossed initials. C.M. Holmes said nothing, but I saw that particular stillness settle upon him. The stillness I had come to recognize as the gathering of threads. Bradstreet folded his arms. "Initials are common enough." "Indeed," Holmes agreed. "And yet this glove is of recent manufacture, tailored rather than purchased ready. Made. The stitching is hand-finished. The owner is particular, perhaps fastidious and careless. You believe it a calling card?" Holmes allowed the faintest suggestion of a smile. "Either that, Inspector, or a warning." Outside, the fog thickened against the windows. The gaslight trembled. The ruby lay upon the velvet, its red heart glowing like a captured ember. Holmes replaced the glove carefully within his pocket. "Watson," he said quietly, "our afternoon's diversion appears to have altered its nature." "You are certain?" I asked. He glanced once more at the fallen jeweler, at the orderly glove, at the stones disturbed in patterns that only he seemed fully to comprehend. "My dear Watson," he replied, "when a man collapses at the precise instant he is about to discuss ownership, when a glove rests too neatly amid disorder, when a physician declares certainty within 30 seconds, then one must assume that either coincidence has grown theatrical or intelligence has intervened. And you favor the latter." Holmes's gaze returned to the ruby. "Intelligence," he said softly, "rarely wastes a stage so carefully prepared." Inspector Bradstreet sighed. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. You may look into it, but until evidence suggests otherwise, Scotland Yard proceeds under natural causes." Holmes inclined his head. "Of course." Yet, as we stepped back into the chill of Regent Street, the glove secure in his pocket and the fog swallowing the shopfront behind us, I perceived that the matter was far from natural in his mind. He paused beneath the dim chandelier's glow filtering through the glass. "Watson," he said, "note the hour. 4:15, the public collapse of a respected jeweler. A glove bearing the initials CM and a ruby whose history may prove more volatile than its appearance suggests." You think the stone connected? Holmes's expression grew distant. I think, he replied, that men seldom fall forward at the very moment they are about to reveal something of value, unless someone prefers silence. He began walking, long strides cutting through the fog. And the glove? I pressed. Holmes's answer came with quiet certainty. The glove, my dear Watson, is not evidence of accident. He glanced once over his shoulder toward the jeweler's shop, now half obscured in mist. It is the first move in a deliberate game, and thus, beneath the dim chandeliers of Regent Street, what appeared to be a simple seizure became the opening act of a mystery whose design was already unfolding, precise, patient, and far from complete. Chapter 2. The powder on the leather. The fog had thickened. By the time we returned to Baker Street, its pale density pressing against the windows of our sitting room, like some amorphous curiosity seeking entry. Holmes wasted no time in ceremony. He removed his coat with an absent motion, placed the glove upon the cleared corner of his chemical table, and drew the lamp nearer. Watson, said he, pray observe with precision. Our case begins not with conjecture, but with matter. The glove lay beneath the lamplight, its black kid surface absorbing illumination, save where faint specks caught and refracted it. At first glance, the residue appeared no more than the ordinary dust of commerce. Yet Holmes's eye, trained to discriminate the exceptional from the mundane, had already isolated its significance. He produced a lens and examined the surface closely. You see here, he said, angling the glove toward me, a fine crystalline deposit. Not random, not atmospheric. Its distribution is selective. I leaned closer. The residue indeed clung most densely along the inner palm and the lower portions of the fingers. Holmes tapped the area gently over a sheet of dark paper. A small cascade of pale particles descended. He brought a pinch of the substance to his nose, inhaled lightly, and then, to my habitual discomfort, touched the faintest trace to his tongue. Holmes, I protested. He ignored me, eyes half closed in concentration. Not talc, he murmured, not warehouse chalk, and certainly not incidental dust. Inspector Bradstreet, who had insisted upon accompanying us to Baker Street, stood with arms folded in patient skepticism. Gloves pass through crates, Mr. Holmes, he said. Warehouses are none too clean, seems straightforward enough. Holmes did not immediately respond. Instead, he crossed to his reagent cabinet and selected a small vial. He added a few drops of distilled water to a sample of the powder upon a glass slide. The particles dissolved partially, leaving behind minute angular crystals. Observe, Inspector, he said calmly. The solubility is incomplete. And note the residue's sharp edges. This is not environmental debris. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. It is a drying compound. Bradstreet raised an eyebrow. For what purpose? For preservation, Holmes replied. The words seemed to hang in the lamplit air. Holmes resumed his examination. Certain chemical agents, volatile in nature, require stabilization during storage or transfer. One may crush a preservative compound and apply it lightly to a surface to prevent premature degradation. It is rarely encountered outside laboratories or highly specialized trades. Bradstreet shifted uneasily. You're suggesting poison? Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he turned the glove once more, focusing the light upon the palm. Watson, what do you observe regarding distribution? I examined the leather carefully. It is concentrated precisely where one would grasp another's hand. Precisely, Holmes said, and not along the cuff, nor the outer back, nor the fingertips exterior, only where warmth and friction would activate it. Bradstreet scoffed lightly. Activated by what? Heat, Holmes replied, and moisture. A silence fell upon the room. You mean to say, the inspector ventured, that this powder becomes what? Dangerous, through contact. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. Certain alkaloidal toxins, he said, remain inert when dry. Introduced to warmth and perspiration, they dissolve rapidly and pass through the skin in quantities sufficient to affect the nervous system. I felt an involuntary chill. "And the symptoms?" I asked. Holmes turned to me gravely. "Sudden weakness, muscular failure, cardiac irregularity, collapse, quite indistinguishable to a hurried physician from seizure." Bradstreet's expression hardened. "You're constructing a theory upon dust." "I am constructing," Holmes replied, "a logical chain. Mr. Harrow showed no history of seizures. He collapsed at the moment of discourse regarding ownership of a valuable stone. A glove bearing another's initials lies arranged with precision upon his display, and upon that glove rests a chemical preservative activated by warmth and friction." He paused. "A handshake, Inspector, can carry more than courtesy." The room was silent, save for the faint hiss of the gas lamp. Bradstreet at last stepped forward. "Suppose you are correct?" Who shook his hand. Holmes's gaze drifted briefly toward the window, where fog pressed like pale wool. "An excellent question." We returned to Regent Street the following morning. Harrow's establishment had been closed pending inquest, but Bradstreet secured us entry. The body had been removed, the velvet cases restored to order, though the ruby remained absent, held temporarily as evidence. Holmes requested the names of all present at the time of the collapse. The clerk, Mr. Alton, provided them reluctantly. Mrs. Davenport, a frequent client. Colonel Sebastian Firth, retired officer and collector. A young gentleman identifying himself as Charles Milverton, a lady whose name had not been recorded. Holmes and myself. Holmes's eyebrow twitched almost imperceptibly. "Charles Milverton," he repeated evenly. "Yes, sir," said Alton. "He was examining a sapphire brooch. Arrived shortly before you." Bradstreet glanced sharply at Holmes. "Shem indeed," Holmes replied. "The name was not unknown to us. Charles Milverton, though rarely prosecuted, was whispered to engage in certain coercive practices, trading upon secrets and indiscretions. A collector, not merely of jewels, but of reputations." Holmes asked quietly, "Did Mr. Milverton greet Mr. Harrow upon entering?" "Yes, sir," said Alton. They shook hands. Mr. Harrow seemed reluctant, perhaps, but civil. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Describe the handshake." The clerk blinked. It seemed ordinary enough. Length, perhaps a moment longer than usual. Bradstreet exhaled slowly. Holmes moved to the display case where Harrow had fallen. He crouched, examining the velvet. "You have cleaned this surface," he observed. "Yes, sir." Holmes frowned faintly, but turned instead to the floor. There, near the baseboard beneath the counter, he located a minute scatter of pale residue, overlooked in the cleaning. He collected it carefully in a small envelope. "Inspector," he said calmly, "I suggest that the body be re-examined." "For what?" "For traces upon the right hand." Bradstreet hesitated only briefly before nodding. The post-mortem, conducted under Holmes's quiet supervision, revealed faint erythema upon the palm of Harrow's right hand. Subtle, easily missed, but present. More telling still was a slight discoloration beneath the fingernails. Holmes remained silent throughout the examination. Only once did he speak. "The toxin, whatever its precise composition, acts swiftly but leaves little trace. Ingenious. A murderer who avoids ingestion, avoids injection, employs civility as his instrument." Bradstreet looked troubled. "But why leave the glove?" he demanded. Holmes's gaze darkened slightly. "That, Inspector, is the more delicate question." We returned once more to Baker Street. Holmes seated himself in his armchair, fingers pressed together. "Consider," he said quietly, "a man who trades in secrets, a man known for calculated intimidation. Such a man does not act impulsively. If he sought to eliminate Harrow, it was for purpose." "The ruby," I ventured. Holmes nodded faintly. "Capable? Certainly. He possesses the knowledge, the composure, and the proximity. Then he is our murderer." Holmes shook his head slowly. "No, Watson. He is either the instrument or the distraction. The glove, yes." Holmes paused beneath a gas lamp, its light haloed in mist. "If Mordaunt delivered the toxin, He did so through his own glove. But the glove bearing Milverton's initials was placed afterward. By whom? Holmes's expression grew thoughtful, almost grave. By someone who wished the narrative to point elsewhere. He resumed walking. The fatal greeting establishes mechanism, but motive remains obscured. Until we understand why Harrow needed silencing, and who feared his words, we tread only the outer edge of this design. He glanced at me with quiet intensity. And I am increasingly convinced that the man who shook Harrow's hand may not be the only one whose glove carried death. The fog thickened around us as we made our way home. Somewhere within London's vast and shadowed commerce, a transaction had been concluded with lethal precision. A handshake had served as courier, a glove had served as accusation, and between them lay a truth still concealed. Chapter 4, Seam, conceals a name the fog had settled thickly over Marylebone that evening, blurring the gas lamps into pale orbs and muffling the rumble of distant wheels. Within our chambers at Baker Street, the fire burned low but steady, casting long amber shadows across Holmes's chemical apparatus. The glove lay once more upon the table beneath the focused glow of a shaded lamp. Holmes had spoken little during our return from Hatton Garden. That stillness, so often preceding revelation, had descended upon him again. I recognized it well, the quiet accumulation of patterns not yet voiced. "Watson," he said at last, "hand me the lens." I complied. He bent low over the glove, studying the interior with minute attention. For several minutes he made no remark. Then he produced from his waistcoat pocket a narrow steel probe and gently pressed along the inner seam where the lining met the cuff. "There," he murmured. "To what do you refer?" I asked. Holmes angled the glove toward me. "Do you observe the minute irregularity in the stitching along this interior fold?" I squinted under the light. At first I saw nothing beyond ordinary handwork. Then, yes, a faint deviation. A thread fractionally darker, a stitch slightly misaligned. "It may simply be repair," I suggested. Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, repairs aim for invisibility. This is concealment." He drew a slender penknife from the table and with extreme delicacy loosened 3 stitches. The lining parted slightly beneath his careful hand. From within the fold, he extracted a tiny fragment of embroidered silk, no larger than a fingernail. It bore the faint outline of a letter. Holmes laid it flat beneath the lens. The embroidered initial was not. IT was an M, but not alone. Beneath the newly stitched overlay, traces of a second letter remained partially visible, a curved stroke inconsistent with the known form of Milverton's mark. Holmes's eyes brightened. "Observe the angle of the serif," he said, "and the base line." The original embroidery formed the letters PM Percival Mordaunt. I breathed. "Precisely." Holmes leaned back slowly. "The outer lining bears CM Charles Milverton. Yet beneath the fold lies PM, crudely obscured." He examined the removed threads between finger and thumb. "These stitches are recent. The silk differs slightly in sheen, and note the clumsiness. No professional tailor executed this alteration." "You mean," I said slowly, "that the glove once belonged to Mordaunt?" Holmes inclined his head. "And was later altered to implicate Milverton." A silence fell between us, heavy with implication. "The glove was not merely placed as misdirection," I said. "It was transformed." "Yes," Holmes replied softly. "Our gentleman wears a borrowed identity." He rose and paced before the hearth. He stitched over the truth, but thread remembers what fingers forget. I could not suppress a shiver. If the glove was originally Mordaunt's, then he delivered the toxin, and afterward altered the glove to cast suspicion upon Milverton. "An elegant maneuver," Holmes said. "Too elegant, perhaps." He stopped pacing and regarded the glove once more. "Consider, Watson. A man capable of chemical sophistication sufficient to prepare a dermal toxin. A man methodical enough to exploit social custom as delivery. Would such a man leave behind a glove bearing his own initials, only to crudely resue another's?" The inconsistency struck me immediately. "It seems careless." Holmes nodded faintly. or staged? Staged by whom? That, he replied, is the question upon which the case now turns. He resumed examination of the inner seam. Note further, he said. The embroidery of the original PM was of superior workmanship. The overlaying CM lacks refinement. The silk is of cheaper grade. You believe the alteration was performed hastily? Yes, likely after Harrow's collapse, meaning someone had access to the glove post. Mortem. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Exactly. We reviewed the timeline. Mordaunt had visited at 11. Negotiations concluded. A handshake delivered the toxin. Harrow collapsed within seconds. Milverton arrived later in the afternoon. Holmes tapped the table thoughtfully. Which suggests, he said, that the glove may not have been left during the initial delivery, but placed afterward, I said. Yes. By Milverton. Holmes shook his head slowly. Milverton is manipulative, but seldom reckless. If he discovered Harrow already dead, would he risk entanglement by altering evidence? It is possible, but improbable. Then who? Holmes turned toward me, eyes bright with intellectual fire. Who else was present? We enumerated them once more. Mrs. Davenport, Colonel Sebastian Firth, an unnamed lady, the clerks, Milverton, Holmes and myself. Holmes's voice grew quiet. Impersonation, Watson, is a subtle art, yet the jewel trade is not so vast that identities pass unchecked. Suppose our Mr. Mordaunt was not entirely what he appeared. You think he assumed another man's name? Holmes nodded. The true Percival Mordaunt is well known, yet the man we met, though resembling the description, may have appropriated certain credentials, but the clerk recognized him. Recognition is often built upon expectation, Holmes replied. A man arrives bearing the manner, knowledge, and bearing of a rival appraiser. Few would demand further proof. He crossed to his desk and opened a directory of trade listings. We must confirm Mordaunt's movements on the day in question. If he can be placed elsewhere at 11 o'clock, then our visitor was an imposter. And the glove? Holmes's lips curved slightly. If the imposter wore gloves treated with toxin, and afterward altered one to implicate Milverton, we confront not rivalry, but calculated impersonation. The fire crackled softly. Holmes returned to the glove and examined the cuff once more. Another detail, he said. He held it up to the light. The wear pattern upon the fingers indicates frequent use by a right-handed man engaged in fine manipulation, likely stone examination, yet the interior sizing is fractionally narrower than Mordaunt's hand. You notice that during the handshake? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. I notice everything. He placed the glove carefully upon the table. Our gentleman adopted a name, delivered a toxin through greeting, altered his glove to misdirect suspicion, and vanished. And Harrow? I asked. Harrow was about to reveal something of consequence regarding the ruby. Holmes's gaze darkened slightly. If Harrow intended to expose a false provenance, a theft, or a deception involving that stone, then his silence was essential. And impersonation allowed the murderer access. Precisely. Holmes stood at the window, peering into the fog-dimmed street. This is no simple rivalry of trade. It is a performance. Identities stitched and resewn, a glove that speaks two names. He turned back toward me. Watson, the discovery within that seam alters everything. Suspicion shifts from open competition to concealed identity. Our adversary is not merely ambitious. He is theatrical and dangerous. Holmes inclined his head. Yes, for a man who alters his own initials upon leather may well alter far more substantial records. He extinguished the lamp above the glove and allowed the firelight to dominate the room. The next step, he said quietly, is to determine whether Percival Mordaunt exists, precisely where he ought to have been when Harrow shook that fatal hand. He paused. For if the real Mordaunt possesses an unassailable alibi, then we hunt not a rival, but an actor. The wind pressed softly against the window pane. Thread had revealed deception. A name had been concealed beneath another. The glove, once a simple clue, now stood as evidence of deliberate impersonation. And somewhere in London walked a man who had worn another's identity long enough to kill. Chapter V. Fay, the borrowed reputation Holmes, lost no time in testing the solidity of Percival Mordaunt's identity. On the morning following our discovery within the glove's seam, he dispatched a telegram through a private commercial line, one of those discreet channels he favored when subtlety was essential. The inquiry was directed to Antwerp, where, according to trade registers, the real Percival Mordaunt had been engaged in prolonged consultation over a diamond exhibition. The reply arrived before dusk. Holmes read it once, folded it with methodical precision, and handed it to me. Mordaunt presently in Antwerp since October. Public appearances confirmed weekly. No departure recorded. Holmes's lips curved faintly. As anticipated. The man we met was an imposter, I said. Undeniably, he resumed his seat by the fire, fingers steepled. Harrow was about to discuss prior ownership which may intersect with matters Mr. Milverton prefers concealed. And the glove? I asked again. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. Either arrogance, he said, or misdirection. Bradstreet, still present, folded his arms. You believe Milverton killed him? Holmes shook his head slightly. I believe the glove wishes us to think so. The inspector frowned. You just argued. I argued, Holmes interrupted gently, that the glove delivered the poison. I did not assert that its owner administered it. The distinction settled heavily in the room. Holmes rose abruptly and crossed to the fireplace. A careful mind leaves nothing accidental, he said. If Milverton is guilty, the glove is foolishly obvious. If he is innocent, the glove is diabolically convenient. He turned toward us. We must ask ourselves, who benefits from directing suspicion toward a man already feared? Bradstreet was silent now. And further, Holmes continued, who possesses sufficient chemical knowledge to prepare such a compound? He glanced at me. Watson, consult your medical references. Seek alkaloids capable of rapid dermal absorption. I shall investigate Mr. Milverton's recent movements. And the ruby? I asked. Holmes's eyes flickered. The ruby, my dear Watson, is not merely a stone. It is motive crystallized. He moved toward the window and gazed into the swirling London fog. Yesterday, a jeweler fell beneath his own chandeliers. Today, we confirm deliberate poisoning by handshake. The glove bears initials that may accuse or deceive. He turned back, voice quiet but resolute. This was no crime of passion. It was calculated, elegant, and designed to resemble nature itself. He paused, and I suspect, he added softly, that the hand which prepared that glove is not yet finished. The fire snapped in the grate. Outside, somewhere in the misted city, a gentleman bearing the initials CM walked untroubled beneath the winter sky. Whether as murderer, pawn, or something more intricate still, we had yet to determine, but the game had unquestionably begun. Chapter 3. The fatal greeting. The inquest into Edmund Harrow's death, convened 2 days after the collapse, held in a somber chamber, whose high windows admitted little of the winter light. The proceedings were conducted with that peculiar blend of solemnity and procedural haste characteristic of such inquiries. Scotland Yard, having been persuaded, though not entirely convinced, by Holmes's chemical findings, refrained from endorsing the physician's original conclusion of seizure. Instead, the cause of death was recorded as sudden systemic failure under suspicious circumstances, pending further investigation. It was during the testimony of the shop's senior clerk, Mr. Alton, that the next crucial detail emerged. Yes, the clerk said, wringing his hands as he addressed the coroner. Mr. Harrow had received a visitor that morning, shortly after 11. A gentleman known in trade circles, a rival appraiser. Holmes, seated beside me, inclined his head slightly. Name? Asked the coroner. Mr. Percival Mordaunt. Holmes's fingers tightened imperceptibly upon his cane. The clerk continued. Mr. Mordaunt examined several rare stones, 2 Ceylon sapphires and a Colombian emerald. He and Mr. Harrow conversed privately in the rear office. The discussion seemed cordial enough, though serious. Was there any disagreement? The coroner pressed. None apparent, sir. Holmes leaned toward me and whispered, "Observe, Watson, how often the most significant tensions are those invisible to observers." After the session concluded, Holmes wasted no time in securing a fuller statement from Mr. Alton. "Describe this Mr. Mordaunt," Holmes requested. The clerk hesitated only briefly. "Tall, sir, spare build, a narrow jaw and sharp cheekbones." His manner was courteous, measured. He chose his words carefully, not one to speak unnecessarily. And his attire. Impeccable dark frock coat, gloves, black leather. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Gloves indoors?" "Yes, sir. I recall remarking upon it privately, but given the cold, I thought little of it." Holmes nodded slowly. "Affectation," he murmured, "or precaution." We departed the inquest hall beneath a sky the color of unpolished pewter, as our hansom rattled toward Baker Street. Holmes sat in uncharacteristic silence. At last I ventured, "You consider Mordaunt our man?" Holmes shook his head. "I consider him essential." Back at our rooms, Holmes resumed his analysis with renewed focus. "Consider the properties of the compound upon the glove," he said. "It was preserved in dry, crystalline form, inert until activated by warmth and moisture, but it would not endure prolonged exposure to natural skin oils without degradation." He paced slowly before the fire. "A glove, Watson, removes the barrier of skin oils. It allows a substance to remain potent until the precise moment of contact." "You believe Mordaunt applied the compound to his own glove?" I asked. Holmes paused. "Possibly. But there is an even subtler alternative." He retrieved the glove bearing the initials CM and placed it upon the table. This glove was found upon the display after the collapse. Its palm bore the preservative compound. Yet witnesses now confirm that Mordaunt wore gloves that morning. I followed his reasoning cautiously. If Mordaunt administered the toxin, he would require a treated surface to touch Harrow's bare hand. Precisely. And he could do so through his own glove. Holmes nodded faintly. But here lies the complication. The glove left at the scene bears the initials CM, Charles Milverton. Then Milverton remains implicated. Implicated, Holmes agreed. But is he the hand, or merely the shadow cast upon the wall? Holmes then requested a detailed account of the precise moment preceding Harrow's collapse. Mr. Alton, though shaken, proved observant in retrospect. "Mr. Harrow and Mr. Mordaunt concluded their discussion shortly before noon," he said. "They returned to the main showroom. Mr. Harrow appeared. Relieved, perhaps, he extended his hand." "And Mr. Mordaunt?" Holmes asked. He clasped it warmly. Both men smiled. "Duration," Holmes pressed. "A moment longer than customary, I recall, thinking it rather formal. And immediately thereafter." Mr. Harrow turned to retrieve a ledger. He took perhaps 3 steps. Then he paused, placed a hand to his temple, and swayed. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Seconds." "Yes, sir." Within seconds, and within minutes, he was dead. The pattern aligned with Holmes's earlier assessment. As we departed, Holmes remarked quietly, "The handshake was not merely social. It was the delivery." That evening he produced a small treatise from his shelves concerning dermal absorption of alkaloids. "Certain compounds," he explained, "act upon the cardiac nerves with remarkable swiftness when introduced through minute abrasions in the skin. A firm handshake, especially between men accustomed to trade, can create sufficient friction to permit entry. And such a compound would leave little trace. Very little. The body's own processes obscure it. A convenient death, masked as natural failure. But why not apply it directly to Harrow's skin?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Because a handshake invites no suspicion. It is the one gesture universally accepted as benign." He fell silent for several moments. "Yet we must not ignore the glove left behind. Could Mordaunt have worn Milverton's glove deliberately?" Holmes considered this. Possible, but improbable. Men of meticulous habit rarely exchange personal attire, and the glove was placed with care after the collapse. not dropped during greeting. Then someone returned to the display after Harrow fell. Just so. The realization deepened the complexity of the crime. Holmes's next move was swift. Through discreet inquiry among London's jewel trade, he obtained information concerning Percival Mordaunt. Mordaunt's reputation was formidable. He possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of gemstones, an unassailable eye for valuation, and a reputation for quiet ruthlessness in negotiation. Yet no scandal clung to him, no criminal whisper shadowed his name. "He is ambitious," said one informant, "but controlled." Controlled men, Holmes remarked later, often conceal the fiercest calculations. 2 days later, Holmes arranged an interview. Mordaunt received us in chambers off Hatton Garden. Modest yet precise, every object aligned with geometric order. He was precisely as described, tall, narrow-jawed, with pale eyes that missed little. His handshake, offered to Holmes, was gloved. Holmes accepted it without hesitation. "You prefer gloves indoors," Holmes observed casually. Mordaunt smiled thinly. "The cold penetrates these old buildings, Mr. Holmes. And yet your office is quite warm." Habit, perhaps. Holmes removed his own glove and examined a sapphire upon Mordaunt's desk. "You visited Mr. Harrow on the morning of his death." "Yes, we concluded negotiations." "And you shook his hand?" "I did." Holmes's gaze fixed upon him, and within seconds he faltered. Mordaunt's expression did not change. "An unfortunate coincidence." "Coincidence," Holmes repeated softly. "You imply something more." "I imply nothing," Holmes replied. "I merely collect facts." Mordaunt leaned back slightly. "I trust you are aware, Mr. Holmes, that Mr. Harrow also entertained Charles Milverton that afternoon." Holmes's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly. "I am aware. Milverton is not known for harmless visits." "Nor," Holmes said evenly, "is death known for punctuality." A silence stretched between them. At length Mordaunt said, "If you suspect me, sir, you will find no impropriety. I conduct my trade openly." Holmes inclined his head. "I hope that proves so." When we departed, I asked quietly, "Do you believe him capable?" Holmes gazed down the fog-dimmed street. Our visitor studied the true Mordaunt's habits. His speech was measured, his knowledge extensive. Letters of introduction were presented, convincing enough to satisfy Harrow's clerk. "Forged?" I asked. "Without doubt, and forged with sophistication." Holmes produced from his desk a small portfolio containing copies of correspondence obtained from Harrow's office. The letters bore Mordaunt's name and seal. Holmes pointed to a minute. Discrepancy. Observe the pressure variation in the pen strokes. The signature imitates fluency, yet hesitates at the second. A man may copy a hand, but muscle memory betrays the forger. You believe Harrow suspected? Holmes's eyes sharpened. I believe he did. He rose and paced slowly. Consider the sequence. An impostor arrives in the morning, conducts private examination of rare stones, and engages in prolonged negotiation. Harrow appears unsettled afterward, yet relieved. He shakes the man's hand within seconds, collapse, and later Milverton arrives, I added. Yes. Holmes paused at the hearth. Impersonation requires preparation. Research observation, access to private habits. Such labor exceeds mere professional jealousy. Then what was the deeper motive? Holmes crossed to his desk and retrieved Harrow's ledgers, which Bradstreet had reluctantly permitted us to examine. Within these pages, he said quietly, lies the true pressure upon our victim. He opened to a recent entry concerning a shipment of uncut diamonds imported from South Africa 3 months prior. The valuation here, Holmes continued, is notably high. Yet in a later margin, added in Harrow's own hand, appears a tentative correction. I leaned closer. The initial valuation estimated the shipment at £30,000. The later notation reduced it dramatically to less than half. That discrepancy would devastate any investor, I observed. Precisely. Holmes tapped the page thoughtfully. Further inquiry reveals that Harrow was not sole owner in this transaction. A silent partner supplied the capital. Name. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. Colonel Sebastian Firth. The same gentleman present in the shop at the time of the collapse? The very same. Holmes allowed the significance to settle. Colonel Firth retired from military service with modest pension. Yet within the last year he has invested heavily in gemstone ventures quietly through intermediaries. And if Harrow corrected the valuation, Firth's capital would be exposed as overextended. Losses would follow. Creditors might press inquiry. Holmes resumed pacing. The impostor's visit coincided precisely with Harrow's intent to re-evaluate the shipment. A rival appraiser's endorsement could formalize the correction. And ruin Firth, I said. Holmes nodded, faintly. Money, he remarked softly, is the shadow that lengthens behind every crime of refinement. The elegance of the scheme now appeared in fuller outline. An impostor assumes Mordaunt's identity, Holmes asked. I believed I did. A gem expert. I had supplied him once before with harmless preservation agents for stone transport. And on this occasion, he inquired specifically about compounds transferable through leather. Holmes's gaze sharpened with unmistakable satisfaction. And his demeanor, measured, informed. He asked precise questions regarding activation temperature and absorption rate. Payment cash. Holmes nodded. The transaction aroused no suspicion. Lascelles regarded him steadily. Mr. Holmes, men who purchase rare reagents seldom volunteer their purpose. I provide compounds, not conscience. Holmes smiled faintly. I would expect nothing less. As we departed into the murky Southwark air, Holmes's expression bore that unmistakable gleam of intellectual confirmation. The glove was not incidental, he said quietly, as our cab rattled toward the bridge. No, I agreed. It was engineered. Precisely, the compound stabilizes the toxin until friction and warmth liberate it. A handshake provides both. The buyer anticipated the method weeks in advance, I said. Yes. Holmes leaned back slightly. The trap was fashioned, long before Regent Street witnessed its tragedy. The implications deepened. This was no spontaneous act of financial desperation, I observed. It was constructed. Holmes nodded. Impersonation, chemical procurement, forged letters, altered glove. Each element prepared in advance. And the name used to purchase the compound was Mordaunt. Which reinforces our earlier conclusion. The impostor adopted the identity not merely for access to Harrow, but to secure materials under credible pretense. I considered this. Which brings us again to Colonel Firth. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. Yes, Firth, as investor, stood to lose ruinous sums if the valuation were corrected. Indeed. And as a former officer, he would possess discipline, strategic foresight, and perhaps acquaintances capable of subtle forgery. Holmes did not immediately respond. Instead, he gazed through the cab window at the river's dark current. There is another consideration, he said at length. The alteration of the glove. Yes. Why conceal PM beneath CM after the fact? If the impostor had already used Mordaunt's name for procurement and access, why complicate matters by introducing Milverton? To widen suspicion, I suggested, perhaps. Holmes tapped his cane lightly against the cab floor. Or to create layered misdirection. He spoke neither too quickly nor too slowly. He asked questions that showed prudence. He volunteered nothing that could be used against him. His composure would have satisfied a banker. Holmes allowed it to settle, then changed the current with a single sentence. I understand you have interests in gemstones, he said lightly. Hale did not start, but there was the smallest pause, an instant in which his mind measured whether to deny, evade, or concede. Occasionally, he replied. In a particular shipment of uncut South African diamonds, Holmes added, still mild. Hale's expression remained smooth. I have minor participation in several ventures. Holmes nodded, as though the matter were no more than an investment choice. Indeed. Then, without haste and without theatricality, He opened a drawer of the desk at which he sat. From within, he withdrew the glove, the black leather glove we had traced through chemicals, initials, and concealment. He placed it on Hale's desk as one might place a document for signature. The effect was immediate, though subtle. Hale's gloved hand, resting near the blotter, trembled, barely, but unmistakably. His pupils contracted. His breathing shifted, controlled yet altered. For the first time, his eyes were not merely attentive. They were struck. Recognition. Holmes's gaze did not harden. He watched with the dispassion of a scientist observing reaction. "A fine glove," Holmes remarked, "though the stitching along the inner seam is regrettably uneven." Hale did not touch it. "I fail to see the purpose of this," he said. Holmes lifted the cuff and exposed the concealed embroidery he had earlier revealed in our rooms. The original Mark half, hidden beneath the crude overlay. "Thread remembers," Holmes said quietly. "What fingers forget." Hale's jaw tightened. Holmes continued, still mild, as though describing nothing more threatening than a flaw in tailoring. "A desiccating compound, nearly invisible upon dark leather, activated by warmth and friction, stabilized to preserve processed alkaloids until the moment of contact. A handshake, so ordinary that even death appears natural." Hale's eyes did not leave Holmes's face. "You are implying a criminal act," he said evenly. "I imply nothing," Holmes replied. "I merely describe a method." The silence grew heavy, as though the very air had become aware of the accusation forming within it. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Harrow intended to correct a valuation," he said. "A correction that would have ruined the man most dependent on error." Hale's composure tried to reassert itself, but the strain remained at the edges, like a crack in ice. "Speculation," he answered. Holmes nodded, as if granting the word its proper place. "Very well. Let us speak of preparation instead." The compound was purchased weeks ago in Southwark. It was requested specifically for transfer through leather. Letters of introduction were forged. A respected name was borrowed, Percival Mordaunt's, though Mordaunt himself has been abroad for months. At the mention of the name, Hale's eyes narrowed fractionally. Holmes watched him as one watches a needle move on a gauge. "You required an actor," Holmes said softly. Hale's gloved fingers tightened upon the arm of his chair. "You have no proof of such a person," he replied. Holmes's expression remained calm. "On the contrary, proof is merely sequence made visible. A man assumed Mordaunt's reputation to gain access to Harrow. A glove carried the compound. Harrow shook that hand and died. Afterward, the glove's initials were altered, Pem concealed beneath CM, to point suspicion at Milverton and bury the true path under scandal." He paused, letting the net settle. "You hired an actor," he repeated, "but you overlooked the tailor." Hale's face did not collapse into confession. He was not that sort of man. Yet the tremor had spoken, and once spoken it could not be unsaid. He stared at the glove with a restrained hostility, as though it were an unwelcome witness. "You are constructing shadows, Mr. Holmes," he said at last. "Be cautious. You do not mistake them for substance." Holmes rose. "Shadows," he replied, "require light behind them." He replaced the glove in his pocket with the same care he might have given a loaded pistol. As we were shown out, Hale's manner returned to outward politeness, but it was the politeness of a door closing, rather than a welcome offered. Only when we stood again in the cold street did I feel the pressure ease from my lungs. Holmes walked a few paces before speaking. "You are certain?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly in the winter light. "Certain of his involvement?" "Yes. Certain of his guilt in law? Not yet." "We still require the actor." Holmes nodded. "Financiers employ distance. They rarely poison with their own hands. Hale is disciplined. He paid for a method and a man, believing both would vanish into the fog." He paused beneath a gas lamp, its halo blurred by mist. "But actors," he added, "are not so disciplined as financiers. And you will find him." Holmes's answer was quiet, confident, and without ornament. "I shall." The pattern now stood sharp and coherent. A silent partner, Victor Hale, threatened with ruin by a corrected valuation. A borrowed reputation, Mordaunt's used to gain access and purchase rare reagents, a glove engineered as container and conduit, and a carefully staged misdirection toward Milverton, meant to drag the inquiry into scandal rather than accounts. As we turned toward Baker Street, the fog gathered again around the lamplight, and I could not help but feel that we were following, not merely footsteps, but a design stitched, resewn, and tightened by a man who believed money could purchase invisibility. Holmes, however, had already seen what thread could remember, and once remembered, it would lead us to the hand that had worn it. Chapter 78, The Actor Unmasked. It is one of Holmes's enduring peculiarities that he can move through London as though the city were a chart already drawn in his mind. Each alley, a line of reasoning, each public house a footnote, each humble lodging, house a margin where some forgotten fact has been scrawled. The map he consults is not of streets, but of habits. And when he seeks a man, he does not merely follow footsteps. He follows appetite, fear, debt, and the quiet gravitations that draw the desperate toward familiar shelter. In the days after our interview with Victor Hale, Holmes altered his routine in a manner I had learned. A woman answered, thin, suspicious, with the hard eyes of one who has seen too many men pass through her rooms with borrowed names. "We want Mr. Lister," Holmes said. "There's no Mr. Lister here," she replied immediately. Holmes produced a coin, held it between finger and thumb, and let it catch the weak light. "There is," he said calmly, "and he is preparing to depart England. I should dislike to disturb the police with unnecessary questions in your hallway." The woman hesitated, her gaze flicking between the coin and Holmes's face. Then, with a grudging motion, she stepped aside. "Second floor," she muttered. "Back room." Holmes ascended without haste. I followed, acutely aware of how thin the stairboards sounded beneath our boots. At the top, Holmes paused, listening. From behind one door came the faint scrape of wood upon wood, the unmistakable sound of a trunk being shut. Holmes nodded once. He rapped. The sound stopped instantly. Silence. Holmes rapped again, slightly louder. "Mr. Lister," he said, voice mild. "You may save yourself the trouble of climbing out the window. The alley below is occupied." There was a sudden movement within, a hurried footstep, a chair shifting. Then the door opened an inch. A pale face appeared, eyes darting. The man was perhaps 30, lean and quick in posture. His hair was carefully trimmed, his jaw narrow, his expression poised between defiance and fear. He wore a coat that attempted respectability but failed by its cheapness. His hands, notably, were gloved, black leather, though worn at the fingertips. Holmes's gaze took him in with one swift survey. "Mr. Percival Mordaunt," Holmes said pleasantly. The man's eyes widened a fraction. Then his mouth tightened. "That is not my name." "No," Holmes replied, "but it was convenient." Before the man could retreat, Holmes pushed the door open with controlled force and stepped inside. I followed. The room was small, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a battered trunk, half packed. Upon the bed lay clothing folded with unusual neatness for a common lodger. On the table beside the window stood a shaving kit and a small jar of dark grease, stage makeup perhaps, or something similar. Holmes moved to the trunk. "Preparing to depart," he observed. "When does your ship sail?" The man's face tightened. "I have done nothing. You have no right." Holmes's hand emerged from his coat pocket, holding the altered glove. The effect was immediate. The man's bravado collapsed as though a hidden wire had snapped. His lips parted, his eyes fixed upon the glove with naked recognition. "You left one behind," Holmes said quietly. "That was unfortunate." The man's gaze flicked toward the door, his body angled minutely, calculating distance. Holmes spoke without raising his voice. "If you run, you will be caught. If you fight, you will be broken. If you speak, you may be saved." "Saved?" The man spat, but the word lacked conviction. Holmes's eyes were steady. "From the gallows," he replied. "I confess the word struck." even me with its bluntness. The man swallowed. Holmes produced a second item, a small envelope containing pale crystalline residue. You purchased a desiccating compound in Southwark, Holmes said. You inquired specifically about transfer through leather. You prepared this glove, you shook Edmund Harrow's hand, and he died. The man's knees appeared to soften. He reached for the chair, grasping it as though it were a rail in a storm. He began, then stopped. Holmes waited. Silence pressed upon the room like the fog outside. At last the man spoke in a rush, as if words might be forced out before courage fled. I didn't mean for it to be like that. Holmes's expression did not change. You meant for him to die, he said simply. The man flinched. They told me it would look natural. They said it would be quick. They said no one would know. Holmes hailed a cab Rayner, climbed in with the resignation of a man who has at last stepped out of his own deceit and into the harsh clarity of consequence. As we drove away, Holmes spoke softly, more to himself than to either of us. The tragedy at Regent Street was engineered weeks before the chandeliers dimmed. A borrowed reputation opened the door. Chemistry supplied the method, money supplied the motive. He glanced at Rayner, and fear supplied the final mistake. Rayner stared at his hands, those gloved hands that had delivered death with the false gentleness of courtesy. Holmes's voice, when he spoke again, held that calm finality I had heard at the end of many pursuits. You played the part, he said. Now you will speak the lines you were paid to silence. And in the grey, salt-stained air of the docks, the actor's mask at last slipped entirely, revealing not merely guilt, but the invisible machinery of the crime behind him. Chapter Igfe, the confrontation at dusk twilight in Baker Street, has a character of its own. The day does not so much end as withdraw, leaving behind a bruised half-light that gathers in corners and settles upon the furniture like dust. On that evening, the fog returned in thin veils, and the gas lamps along the street burned with a weak, uncertain glow, their flames fluttering whenever a draught found its way through a crack in the panes. Holmes had arranged everything with the same unhurried exactness with which he arranged a chemical experiment. The sitting room was neat to the point of austerity. The fire burned low. The lamps were turned down so that faces, when they entered, would be lit from below, throwing their expressions into sharper relief. It was not theatricality for its own sake, Holmes understood. As he understood all human creatures, that atmosphere can pry open a mind more effectively than force. Victor Hale arrived promptly at the appointed hour. Mrs. Hudson showed him in with her usual discretion. Hale removed his hat and coat with measured politeness, as though he were visiting a solicitor, rather than the man who had placed a net about his life. His gloves were dark this time, black kid fashionable and immaculate. Yet even in that first moment I noted that his composure, so carefully maintained in Bloomsbury, seemed thinner here. Baker Street was not his territory. "Mr. Holmes," he said calmly, "your message suggested urgency." Holmes rose from his chair and inclined his head. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Hale. Pray sit down." Hale seated himself opposite Holmes, his posture straight, his movements controlled. He glanced once around the room, taking in the dim light, the closed curtains, the quiet. Holmes did not offer him tea. Instead, he placed a small packet upon the table between them. Hale's gaze flicked to it. "What is that?" he asked. Holmes's voice was mild, a confession. Hale's expression did not change. "I do not understand." Holmes opened the packet and withdrew a single sheet of paper, Felix Rayner's signed statement, obtained under the supervision of Inspector Bradstreet and witnessed by myself. Holmes did not push it toward Hale like a weapon. He merely set it down where it could be read if the man chose to look. Hale did not. For several seconds the room was silent, save for the faint hiss of the gas lamp. At last Hale said, "If you believe I will be shaken by an anonymous document, you misjudge me." Holmes nodded. "Perhaps. Then let us proceed without it." He leaned back slightly, fingers steepled, his eyes steady. "You employed a man named Felix Rayner," Holmes began. "A touring player, talented, indebted, and therefore persuadable. You instructed him to assume the identity of Percival Mordaunt, a respected gem expert currently in Antwerp." Hale's eyes narrowed a fraction. "A fantasy," he said evenly. Holmes continued as though he had not spoken. "You provided forged letters of introduction. You supplied details of Mordaunt's habits, his speech, his manner with stones, his professional authority, so that Harrow would accept him without question." Hale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I have never heard these names," he said. Holmes's voice remained calm. 3 weeks before Edmund Harrow's death, a rare desiccating preservation compound was purchased in Southwark. The buyer asked specific questions: stability on leather activation by warmth, transfer through a handshake. The purchase was recorded under Mordaunt's name. Hale's gaze drifted, only for an instant, toward the mantelpiece, then returned to Holmes. A flicker of calculation passed through his face, quickly smoothed away. Holmes watched it with quiet interest. "That compound," Holmes went on, "was combined with processed alkaloids to produce an agent nearly invisible on dark-kid leather. It remained inert until compressed between warm hands, then it released its toxin." Hale's voice, when he answered, was slightly drier than before. "You speak as though you have conducted the experiment yourself." Holmes smiled faintly. "In effect, Mr. Hale, you conducted it upon Edmund Harrow." Hale's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. He did not speak. Holmes continued, building the chain link by link, as one lays stones across water. Rayner visited Harrow's shop at 11 o'clock in the morning. He presented himself as Mordaunt. He examined the stones. He discussed a valuation, specifically the valuation of an uncut diamond shipment. Hale's eyes flickered. Holmes's tone remained dispassionate. Harrow intended to correct that valuation downward. He had already marked the discrepancy in his ledgers. That correction would have exposed the inflation upon which your expected profit depended. Hale's lips tightened. He stared at Holmes with a stillness that was no longer mere composure. "The figures were not mine," he said. "They were very much yours," Holmes replied softly. He reached to the side table and produced Harrow's ledger, open to the page Holmes had earlier shown me. He placed it upon the table, turning it so Hale could see the figures without touching it. "Here is the original valuation," Holmes said. "Here is Harrow's correction. Here is your share, dominant under the inflated figure, catastrophic under the corrected one. You stood to gain from error and to lose from truth." Hale's nostrils flared slightly. "And so," Holmes continued, "you sought to preserve fortune through murder." The words fell into the dim room like cold metal. Hale spoke at once, too quickly. "I deny it." Holmes nodded as though this were expected. "Of course." He lifted the altered glove from his drawer and placed it beside the ledger. "This glove," he said, "was prepared with the compound. It originally bore the initials PM. Those initials were crudely stitched over with CM in cheap silk to implicate Charles Milverton and draw attention towards scandal rather than finance." Hale's eyes fixed upon the glove for a moment. His mask slipped, not in terror, but in a hard internal weighing, as if he saw the entire structure of his plan reflected back at him, thread by thread. He said nothing. Holmes's voice remained calm. "Rayner altered the glove in panic after learning you had miscalculated one element. My presence in the shop, he intended to retrieve it but abandoned it instead. Chance unsettles criminals more than conscience, Mr. Hale." Hale's gaze shifted to Holmes's face. "You expect me to accept the word of a frightened actor?" he asked, voice thin with contempt. "A man who would say anything to save his own neck?" Holmes inclined his head. "On its own, no, but his confession is not alone." He gestured lightly. "The chemist's ledger in Southwark, the telegram from Antwerp, placing the real Mordaunt abroad, the forged letters in Harrow's office, the financial records establishing your stake, the altered stitching, the chemical residue on the glove and under Harrow's nails." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Each fact supports the next until denial becomes merely noise." For a long moment, Hale remained still. The gaslight flickered. Shadows moved across his face, making him appear older than when we had first met him. Then he drew a slow breath. "You cannot prove I instructed him," he said at last. Voice lower, Holmes's eyes remained steady. "You will contest it in court," he replied. "That is your right." Hale's mouth tightened. "And if I say nothing?" Holmes's expression did not change. "Then your silence will be consistent with your character." Hale stared at the table, the ledger, the glove, the confession he still had not touched. His shoulders seemed to settle inward by a fraction, as though a weight had shifted from imagination into certainty. The fight went out of him not with drama, but with gradual exhaustion. He said nothing more. Holmes rose and walked to the bell. "Pull." I realized then that everything had been arranged in advance. Even Hale's arrival had been timed to coincide with the approach of Scotland Yard. Holmes rang once. The sound echoed faintly in the quiet room. Within moments there came the heavy tread of boots on the stairs and the familiar, brisk voice of Inspector Bradstreet. Holmes opened the door. "Inspector," he said calmly, "Mr. Victor Hale is here." Bradstreet entered with 2 constables behind him. His eyes took in Hale, the glove, the ledger, and Holmes's composed face. "Hale," Bradstreet said, "you are under arrest on suspicion of conspiring in the murder of Edmund Harrow." Hale did not rise at once. For a moment he sat as though he had not heard. Then he stood slowly, adjusting his coat with an automatic gesture of dignity. His eyes met Holmes's, not pleading, not furious, but bitter with the knowledge that intellect had undone wealth. As the constables moved to take him, he spoke at last, voice quiet and sullen. "You think this is justice?" Holmes replied evenly. "I think it is arithmetic." Hale's mouth tightened, and he allowed himself to be escorted toward the door. Outside, as the door opened, the dusk poured in grey and cold. The sky above Baker Street was the color of tarnished silver, and the gas lamps burned like weak stars against the encroaching night. Hale descended the steps between constables, his figure swallowed gradually by the fog and the gathering dark. Holmes closed the door softly and stood for a moment without speaking, as though listening to the last fading footfalls. Then he turned back to the fire, and in its low glow his face looked once more like the familiar mask of calm reasoning. "The case," he said quietly, "was never about jewels, Watson." "No," I replied. Holmes's gaze rested briefly upon the glove, the engineered conduit of death. "It was about the value men place upon truth," he murmured, "and the lengths they will travel to keep it mispriced." The gaslight flickered again, and the shadows in the room shifted. No longer ominous now, but merely ordinary, as though the darkness itself had conceded defeat. Chapter XV. The lesson of the glove, when Victor Hale had been taken away, and the last echoes of boots upon the stairs had faded into the ordinary noises of the street. An unusual stillness fell over Baker Street. It was not the stillness of emptiness, but of return, of a room resuming its familiar shape after strain, like a body exhaling after pain. Mrs. Hudson brought fresh coal, stirred the fire, and withdrew with the tact of one who understands that certain conversations prefer privacy. Holmes remained standing for some minutes by the window, watching the fog thicken along the street lamps. The light outside had diminished to a dull pewter glow, and the glass carried faint reflections of our room. Books, chair backs, the brass of the hearth, like ghostly copies hovering in the pane. If Holmes felt satisfaction at the conclusion, he displayed it as he displayed most emotions, by refusing them any theatrical expression. At last he turned, crossed the room, and drew from his pocket the black glove. The sight of it stirred in me an irrational unease. It lay inert, folded upon itself, no longer dangerous now that its secret had been drawn out, and its chain of consequences fixed to a human name. Yet I could not look upon it as mere leather. A knife, at least, bears honest intent in its shape. This glove had worn the shape of politeness. Holmes placed it not upon the table where he did his chemical work, but upon the mantel beside the clock, as though installing it there as a reminder rather than as evidence. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly, "how civility masks peril." I took the offered cue, but found no easy reply. My mind returned again and again to the image of Regent Street, the green velvet, the disciplined symmetry of jewels, the wavering chandeliers of gaslight, And then Harrow's sudden collapse, so swift, so outwardly natural, that most had accepted it at once as fate. "A handshake," I said at last. "I can scarcely reconcile it." Holmes's mouth tightened faintly, not into amusement, but into that expression he wore when he considered a thing both obvious and troubling. "Precisely because you cannot reconcile it," he replied. "It was chosen." He seated himself, long limbs settling into the chair with a practiced ease. The firelight caught the sharp planes of his face. He looked, in that moment, less like a man who had concluded a case than like a man who had taken note of a principle. "A blade announces itself," he continued. "A bullet, even when unseen, carries the vulgar signature of violence. Poison may be subtle, but it still requires an intrusion. Food, drink, a puncture. The genius of this method lay in its familiarity." He gestured faintly toward the glove. "A gesture of goodwill," he said, "turned into a weapon." I recalled Felix Rayner's confession, the rehearsed identity, the chemical purchase, the deliberate pressure of the clasped hands. And beyond that, I recalled Victor Hale's face in our sitting room, the brief denial, the collapse into silence, the bitter knowledge that his refinement had failed him at last. "Evil," I said, "seems to have improved its manners." Holmes's eyes flickered with something like dry approval. "Evil has always had manners," he answered. "It must, if it wishes to approach. The brute attacks from the dark alley and is met with resistance. The refined man enters by invitation. He is offered a chair, a glass of port, a handshake." He leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled. "Custom and courtesy," he said, "are not merely social ornaments, Watson. They are pathways, and pathways can be used in either direction." My thoughts returned to Edmund Harrow, his spare frame, his careful speech about the ruby's internal flame, his momentary relief after the morning negotiation. It seemed tragic now to imagine that relief had been the last ease his nerves would ever know. "He was killed," I said softly, "because he wished to correct an appraisal." Holmes nodded. "A correction," he replied, "is a dangerous thing when another man's fortune depends upon error." Harrow possessed a conscience, perhaps not saintly but sufficient to trouble him when numbers did not match truth. And Hale, I said, possessed only calculation. Holmes's gaze turned briefly to the mantel clock, as if measuring the thought. "Calculation," he said, "without conscience becomes cruelty." Hale did not strike the blow himself. That is what men like him tell themselves when they sleep. He employed an intermediary, purchased chemistry, borrowed a reputation, and sat at a distance. He believed distance absolved him. Holmes's voice was quiet, but it carried that steel I had heard when he spoke of men who hid behind wealth or title. "He learned," Holmes continued, "that distance merely postpones consequence." I rose and crossed to the mantel, staring at the glove. It seemed absurdly ordinary in form, something one might see at any respectable gathering, offered by any gentleman, stepping from his carriage in winter. Yet it had borne within it the mechanism of death as neatly as a pistol bears its charge. "The velvet of Regent Street," I murmured, "was like a stage." Holmes glanced up. "Indeed," he said. "A stage dressed in refinement, green velvet, polished glass chandeliers, and behind the display, greed rehearsing its lines." I could not help but think of the actor himself, Felix Rayner, whose talents had been bought for murder. He was guilty, yet pitiable in a way Hale could never be. He had played a part for money. Hale had written the play for profit. "You often say criminals rely on routine," I remarked. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "Yes, routine, and the public's devotion to ordinary explanations. The physician at Regent Street saw a man collapse and cried seizure because it fit his expectation. The clerk saw a known name in a letter and accepted it because it fit his world. The crowd saw a glove and assumed accident because accident is comforting. Each assumption was a rung in the ladder by which murder climbed." "And you," I said, "refused the assumptions." Holmes shrugged slightly, as though the matter were inevitable. "It is my trade," he replied, "to distrust the convenient." He leaned back, And for a moment the familiar detachment returned to him fully, the man of logic, composed, austere. Yet there was also, beneath it, the moral gravity that so many failed to see until it revealed itself in action. "There is a lesson here," he said at last. I waited, Holmes's gaze fixed upon the glove. "Refinement is not virtue," he said quietly. "It is merely polish, and polish reflects whatever lies beneath it." The fire shifted, throwing a ripple of light across the leather. In that brief flicker, the glove seemed almost to move, as though it retained some memory of warmth. Holmes continued, voice calm. "Remember, Watson, evil rarely presents itself as a monster. More often it presents itself as a gentleman, with clean cuffs, a controlled voice, and an outstretched hand." I felt again the chill which had come over me when Harrow's fingers twitched among the scattered sapphires. "And yet," I said, "the weapon was so slight." Holmes inclined his head. "That is why it succeeded," he replied. "The world guards itself against obvious threats. It leaves the door open to the familiar." He rose, crossed to the mantel, and looked once more at the glove, as though sealing the matter in his mind. "Thus ended," he said softly, "the affair of the powdered glove." Outside Baker Street lay quiet beneath the thickening fog. The lamps burned steadily now, their halos blurred but constant. Somewhere beyond our window the city resumed its endless motion. Carriages rolling, voices calling, doors closing, fortunes being risked and reputations bargained for in dim rooms. Within our sitting room, the case had closed. Not with the crack of a gun nor the stain of blood, but with the quiet understanding that death had traveled through the warmth of a gentleman's hand. And as I watched Holmes stand in thoughtful silence before the fire, I could not shake the notion that in London, so proud of its manners and its outward order, there were countless gloves, countless handshakes, and countless polite gestures, any one of which might conceal a peril no eye but Holmes's would ever detect.